and the sun shines through these windows. And on top of the structure rests the dome.
And when you add a cylindrical base to the dome, something very different starts to happen. At 7.5 on the Richter scale, it's the cylinder that collapses, bringing the dome crashing down.
What it clearly is a building that's a bit on the edge. You know, it's been patched up to the point where it stopped moving. So there's no factors of safety in there, really. There's no latitude or room for movement. And so when an earthquake comes along and literally shakes it all around and changes the orientation of certain things, it gets pushed to a position where it's no longer structurally viable and in due course falls down.
Perhaps fortunately for him, Isidore himself had died in the 2 decades since the completion of the church. So it fell to Isidore's nephew, Isidore the Younger, to repair the damage caused by their mistakes. How could he make sure that the dome would not fall down again? The dome created by Isidore the Younger to replace the dome which collapsed in 557 is a spectacular feat of design. Isidore recognizes the core of the problem, the cylinder on which the dome had been sitting. He realizes that if he gets rid of the cylinder, he has removed the weak link in the structure. So he remodels the upper parts of the north and south arches, altering the distance that the dome needs to span. However, a true hemisphere could no longer solve the problem. If Isidore made the dome a perfect half-sphere, the weight bearing down on the pendentives would no longer channel properly into the supports. So he adjusted the radius of his dome to match the angle of the pendentives. It was no longer a perfect hemisphere, but it was more stable.
Isidore the Younger's solution to the design problem of Hagia Sophia was rational, it made sense, and it was a little bit conservative, but it made sure that the dome stayed standing.
Yet perhaps Isidore the Younger's smartest play was simply to take his time. It took him 4 years to repair the dome, more than 2/3 of the time it took his predecessors to build the entire church. He wasn't taking any chances. The narratio claims that the scaffolding used to support the center of the dome remained in place for a whole year, until the mortar had fully settled. Despite numerous earthquakes, his dome has stood for more than 1,400 years. Ironically, one of the reasons it stood for so long in such a notorious earthquake zone is down to Anthemius and Isidore themselves, because they designed it to be earthquake-proof. When you examine the cathedral in detail, there's evidence that Anthemius and his partner were doing all they could to guard against the weaknesses in the structure.
If you look at Hagia Sophia, there are windows where there are cracks in the Pantheon. The reason for that is that where the cracks are is tension in the building. When there's tension, it cracks. So his attitude was that if it's going to crack anyway, why do I put the material in there and allow it to crack? So he put windows in there.
They also built shock absorbers into the columns.
They knew it was an earthquake zone. There were earthquakes while they were actually building it. So how do you resolve that problem of allowing this structure to be built and to stand up? And they came up with a very ingenious solution, and this was to use lead to base the column in, but also for the capitals as well. This allows the column to flex to a certain extent, to move back and forth. For almost 1,500 years, still standing. A remarkable piece of engineering work.
Yet, Anthemius and Isidore went one gigantic step beyond that. Professor Chakmak's team has examined the Byzantine cement under an electron microscope, and what they discovered was remarkable.
They mix it with non-salted sand, river sand, and lime, and this forms the calcium silicate. And the fact that the brick and the mortar are made out of the same thing allows them to interact much more strongly. So that if there are cracks that happen in the building, they can heal over long periods of time.
Instead of widening, the calcium silicate within the mortar rebonds with itself, closing any hairline crack that is developed. Anthemius and Isidore created earthquake-resistant cement almost 1,300 years before it was officially invented. It is no wonder that their dome stood for 20 years despite its inherent defects.
Essentially, that building might have stood for another 1,000 years if it hadn't seen an earthquake of this magnitude in that time.
It is no surprise that its replacement has stood for 1.5 millennia. But the story doesn't end there. In 1453, Constantinople fell to the Ottoman Turks, and Hagia Sophia was converted into a mosque, gaining 4 beautiful minarets to call the faithful to prayer. And the Blue Mosque, built directly opposite, shows just how influential Hagia Sophia was to become in Muslim mosque design. It remains a symbol for both Christian and Muslim alike. Hagia Sophia, truly a magnificent ancient megastructure.